All right, let's see how Node exactly deals with binary data and encoding. Let's take a quick look at buffers in Node. To start with, we can go to nodejs.org and go to the documentation. Go to Docs and then the API, and we can look at the built-in buffer object. The buffer is created on the C++ side of the Node core and then made available through the JavaScript side. And it stores binary data, and it has a lot of methods for things that you can do to deal with binary data. We can convert between buffers and strings, for example. So we can store strings as binary data in a buffer with a particular encoding, a character encoding, as we saw before, like UTF-8. We can also encode, for example, in base64, which is sometimes used in web applications when encoding various things for security purposes. But ultimately, the buffer holds raw binary data, zeros and ones, but it does let us figure out how to switch between those zeros and ones and strings, assuming that we're storing string information. All right, let's take a look. All right, so I have my empty app.js file, and I'll create a variable and make it a new buffer. Now, we're going to notice that because buffer is such a fundamental concept within Node, dealing with binary data is such an important thing, we didn't even need to go and use the require function to get access to the buffer. Instead, Node.js made it global, kind of like we did when we originally looked inside of V8 and made our little command line interface app and added our own feature. Well, this is a feature that's globally available to JavaScript, kind of like JavaScript already has dates, for example. I can make a new date. Well, you can just make a new buffer without having to use the require statement. However, we do have to give it some data. So I could either make a buffer and say the size, because the buffer is intended to be a particular finite size, a particular amount of memory. Or I can just give it some string value, and I can specify the encoding. Now, if I don't specify the encoding, if I leave this off, UTF-8 is actually the default. But I'll just put it here so that we keep in mind that what I've done is I've asked the buffer to take this string and convert it to binary data. And in order to convert it, it will use the UTF-8 encoding. So I'm saying we'll take this, use the Unicode character set, and then the UTF-8 encoding in order to figure out what string of binary digits, what string of bits, should represent each character, like we saw earlier. So now I can just console.log the buffer and see what happens. I'll do node app.js, and there it is. The buffer is an object, and it contains, as we see, these 5 characters, 5 pieces of binary data. Now, it's outputting in what's called hexadecimal notation to make it a bit shorter and easier to read, but this is binary data that's actually being stored. I can then, for example, convert back to a string, and since it knows what the encoding is, it can look at that binary data and go back up the tree and convert it back into characters. So there's hello. I can even, interestingly, take the buffer and convert it to JSON. And if I do that, we'll see that I have this object now, this JSON data, and the type is buffer. This is really a string that looks like JavaScript data, but it's JSON. But I could convert this to a JavaScript object if I wanted. And the data itself is an array of 5 numbers. And you might remember those numbers. That's the Unicode character set. So I can actually pull those numbers out, and that was converted for me to base 10 notation instead of pure binary. So the buffer contains the raw binary data. I can specify encodings if it's strings, and I can pull that out and use it and convert it into other formats. The buffer itself behaves rather like an array. So I can actually go out and use brackets to get a particular one of those numbers. So there it is. So I can use the buffer somewhat like an array. And I can also write data to the buffer. As if I was about to write world, I'll just put WO, and then let's output the buffer, and let's do toString to see what happened. So I do that, and this time notice that the WO overwrote the HE in hello. Remember that buffers are meant to be a finite piece of data, just a certain amount of memory available that things will be coming into and leaving. So when I wrote to the buffer, since I initialized it to allow for 5 characters, it overwrote those 2. It didn't expand or stretch. It simply started overwriting the data in the buffer. Because the expectation is that as things come into the buffer, we pull them out when the buffer is full and process it and then keep putting things into the buffer. All right, now, in reality, it's quite unusual. It's not very often that you will directly deal with the buffer. You might, but it's not always the case. Most times, buffers are something that's coming back from some other utility or some other object, some other feature within Node.js. However, it's good to know what they are and the various things that you can do with them, since you will be getting buffers given to you by other features within Node. All right, let's move on.